So, Julie, I was curious about your perspective on this because, when I was younger, I spent a lot of time studying different spiritual perspectives and doing a lot of meditation and spending time in spiritual communities, both in North America and also in Asia. And one of the things that I noticed was kind of both a personal experience and also just what I was noticing with people around me is that sometimes there was a lot of fragmentation that was happening in these meditation retreats.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes I think back to those experiences and I feel like I was just dissociated for 10 days straight. And then watching people around me having these kind of disintegrated, fragmented states. And it really wasn't until I got into the somatic work where I started to really understand the importance of having a body and being embodied and using that as a base for some of the more spiritual or personal growth work. And I wonder what your kind of take around that is with some of these spiritual communities and some of the spiritual teachers and what you have made out of that.
I see that a lot. A lot of people who enter into these expansive states that initially feel really wonderful, and then they begin to feel like they're coming apart, which, we could say from a psychological perspective that they start to fragment or dissociate. But there's also a lot of fear and terror that come up that's connected. And we can relate this back to, again, developmental trauma, that in the face of, especially the very early trauma, the first year or two of life, when we are facing something that's threatening, we do, dissociate and we do fragment. And if that hasn't been resolved and healed, when we move into these more spiritually oriented environments, especially on retreat, where there just seems to be more space held there for people to go into this expansion. What will come up, or what tends to come up, is this experience of dissociation and fragmentation and the terror that they experienced back then as a 6-month-old or a 1-year-old. And it's incredibly disorienting. And then, of course, when that happens, if there's not the right support around, our defenses kick up even more. We become even more dissociated, or we get a little bit more neurotic, or, psychosis can kick in the worst situations, because it is really, really frightening.
Yeah.
And if there's been, intense dissociation, and you begin to move into a state where you're moving into a vast expanse, or dissolution of the self, because this is where having a strong sense of self is really important. We say in many of the traditions, you have to have a strong sense of self before you can be no self. No self meaning recognizing that we're not an individual, we're something great, much greater. Because in the process of what we think of as crossing over, right, where our individual consciousness flows into the mother consciousness, we can use that as a metaphor. It feels like a dissolution of the self. Now, if you've had fragmentation in your past, or if you fragmented in your past, or dissociation that hasn't been healed, and you start to move into that dissolution process, it can be terrifying and will just further the fragmentation in terror. So I work with that a lot, and then that takes a lot of work to come back together. And fortunately, some meditation teachers now are recognizing that and are having people who are more somatic-oriented therapists.
Yep.
In the ashram or wherever it is these retreats are taking place, to begin to hold that space. But I do think more education or more knowledge or information needs to be given about that, because it's such a terrifying and unhealthy experience to go into, and difficult to re-knit and reintegrate after you've gone through that.
So when you have clients that have this really early trauma, so maybe they have the dissociation, the fragmentation from the really early parts of their childhood, and they are attracted to some of these retreats or centers, what's your professional suggestion for these sort of clients?
Depending how embedded they are in the actual community, and what practices they're doing. You know, some meditative practices are just dissociative. They're more dissociative. And so sometimes the suggestion is, you know, maybe leave that aside for now and do maybe more body-oriented practices, you know, or maybe leave it at, you know, maybe leave all of those practices aside for a little while until we build up that sense of self or agency that has the capacity to not get terrified when we open into that great, you know, that large expanse. But again, just as in NARM, I mean, go through these initial steps of reconnection and safety and boundaries, really the foundational work of resolving early trauma and just educating people the importance of that, that, you know, the other stuff's not going to go away, right? Presence is always there. Our true nature is always there. You know, we don't have to worry about losing that, but we do maybe want to be concerned about what's blocking us from knowing that directly and continuously.
Yeah, I feel like this is such an important information to get out there, because I do think there's a strong attraction to we talked earlier about kind of a spiritual bypass. There's a strong attraction, you know, which makes a lot of sense, because dealing with our emotions and in our early trauma is messy and painful and scary territory. And so there's a strong attraction often to these approaches that might give us the sense that we can bypass that territory. And I just think it's so useful the way that you're framing it about how, you know, our trauma healing work can really support and reinforce our spiritual growth work. And
we can't skip steps. You know, anybody can, you know, fall into enlightenment at any moment, but it's very, very rare for that to be, you know, a 24/7 experience for the rest of this life. No, something at some point will come up, whether we're aware of it or not, that will obscure or eclipse that realization. And, you know, we try and frame it as something just wasn't ready. So let's address that so we can have a fuller, deeper, more present opening. But it's also about feeling more alive as a human being in the human body and this human journey, and joy, experiencing more joy. And that joy comes from the inside, not from, you know, some place out here that we may have got to. It's an inner experience of aliveness and connection.
Well, great, Julie. I mean, I think this will be really helpful for a lot of people, because there are so many people that are really interested in spiritual growth work and have early trauma, and it can be a real resource for them, you know, like we've been talking about, of how to kind of integrate the two and understand these ways that we're disconnected and ways that we can support continued increased connection to ourselves and to a larger spirit.
Yeah. And then ultimately our perspective will shift. Just to say this sort of about the end stages, if you will. Of course, there is no end. There is nothing to seek, nothing to gain, and so forth in spirituality. But it's at some point our perspective shifts. You know, we're so used to looking outwardly at the world. When we begin to shift and look inwardly, at some point, our main view or vantage point is no longer from this, you know, individual habituated self, but is from something much vaster. And so the stronger the sense of self is, the more we clear the way, if you will, to build that core self, and the greater the chance, the potential for that perspective to shift. That we're both this localized self and something much greater, and that they're actually not separate or different.
Yeah, it seems like a very profound coming home.
Right. Yeah.
Well, thanks again, Julie. Really appreciate the time, and I can't wait for us to continue these conversations.
Yeah, me too. It's lovely to speak with you about this, Brad. All right. Take care.
Thank you.
Okay.